Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is November 24th, 2022. And let's get over the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? So, quick update in the Svatove front. So, there is visual confirmation today that the Ukrainians have control or seized partial control over the town of Kuzemivka, which is a town outside of Svatove and on the road that leads to the town of Svatove. So it's great news. It brings the Ukrainian forces about 12 kilometers. If we calculate from the hills overlooking the town, it's about 12, 13 kilometers. So overall, the Ukrainian forces are getting more and more closer to Svatove. And yes, it's a very grinding fight right now. The Ukrainian forces no longer have the element of surprise as they did with Kharkiv and even Kherson. At this point, there's a lot of defenses being built by the Russians. As I've mentioned multiple times, Svatove is the key city because essentially the Ukrainians, once taking Svatove, can only go south towards Lysychansk, Luhansk, and really cut off the Russians from the north, but they can also secure their borders north, right by Russia, as you can see here. This, I think, once the Ukrainians break through Svatove, they will divide their forces in two, essentially pushing some forces north and the other ones on south, just to protect them from being obviously pushed from the Russian side, because this is where they would be the weakest. However, on this side, as you can see, there's a lot of hills, so the Russians don't have many roads leading towards this part of the oblast. So they will probably have to take a very dangerous road from Urazovo or from Cherkovo, as you can see here. There's two main road arteries, but if the Ukrainians manage to cut it off here, that's pretty much game over for them. So either way, I think that obviously it's going to be important to secure this region and the south of Luhansk. Apart from that, there haven't been many other movements. The Russians still continue pushing in Bakhmut and around the city of Donetsk with minimal gains and massive losses on their side. It's hundreds and hundreds of soldiers per week. They're being wasted on these small gains. They're not really going anywhere. Again, the Russians have put all their chips on this front. They think they're going to get a breakthrough, but even if they do somehow get to Bakhmut, the amount of losses they've been having in the last few weeks and months have pretty much exhausted them, and you have to regroup. And Kramatorsk is going to be another Bakhmut. Yes, they'll probably, if they manage to get Bakhmut, they'll probably be able to manage to get to Kramatorsk somehow, if that happens. But it'll be another Bakhmut with months and months of fighting. By that time, the Russian army will be exhausted. So I don't really see any of this moving really quickly for the Russians, if not at all. And we'll see what happens on this front. It's like every day we're hearing of reports. You can see the amount of arrows as well. The Russians are trying everything, like trying to go through multiple different towns and cities, and they just can't get through the Ukrainian defenses. And that's been ongoing for months. Let's not forget that this front has been about a month and a half. This has been since July, at least, if not late June, that the Russians start really pushing hard towards Bakhmut. So they've gained minimal amount of ground for almost 3-4 months of fighting. And the Russians also are a little bit panicking. There's a lot of Telegram channels saying that the Ukrainians are planning to do an offensive in Zaporizhia. And again, Zaporizhia has been the most quiet front for both forces. Not much has happened since the Russians took Mariupol, and they kind of got a little bit of territory around here. But it's been a very quiet front. Why? Because you can see the terrain here is very flat. There's not many hills in Zaporizhia, not a lot of forest cover either. So you're very open, and any offensive can be quickly found out by both forces. So I think for now it's going to be quiet unless there's a very successful push by the Ukrainian forces on this side of Kherson. I believe a coordinated attack from Zaporizhia would really start crippling the Russians and make them perhaps collapse towards Crimea or push them towards Donetsk, because this is where the Russian borders are. But for now, it's quiet. So, just a quick couple pictures. As you see, the demining still continues in Kherson. There's a lot of mines and other things that need to be cleared out, worth probably in the thousands. And this is due to the fact that the Russians occupied Kherson from the beginning of the end of February, and there's a lot of mines and other artifacts that are left. So it's a really big job by the Ukrainian forces, and the sappers that are risking their lives, clearing that up. And you can imagine how many did the Russians leave. And I'll show you video as well that shows you how they just scatter it like grass seeds all over. So yeah, Boris Johnson, and that was really, I was surprised by this interview that he had. And you can see that, you can find the video if you look it up on YouTube. But he claimed, and very surprising from him, to really kind of, it was kind of a personal attack, I think, towards Macron and Schultz and the then leader of Italy, Mario Draghi, basically saying that Europe was really ready to give up on Ukraine from the very first week that Russia would have invaded Ukraine, pretty much not putting any faith in Ukraine, not trying to help Ukraine whatsoever. And we saw with, I remember vividly in January and February how Europe, apart from the United Kingdom, wasn't really supporting Ukraine, in terms of giving the assistance that Ukraine needed. It was only the United States and Britain. I think Ukraine owes a lot to both of these nations because they believed in Ukraine. They were the strongest allies. And the others, like France and Germany, were sort of like dancing around the question if they would be helping Ukraine or not. And we saw as well with Germany for the first couple months of the war, they were still dancing around the question. They weren't sure if Russia would win, and they were scared. And the same with the French. Macron didn't believe until the very last end. You can see here with what Boris says is that the German view is at one stage that if it were going to happen, the invasion, which would be disaster, then it would be better for the whole thing to be over quickly and for Ukraine to just fold. Great. And the French were in denial until the very end. That's true. Remember when Macron, beginning of February, went to Moscow and said, we have achieved a deal, or we're very close to achieving a deal with Russia and ultimately peace in Ukraine. Only then, after a couple of weeks after, you have a global war happening in Eastern Europe. He looked very foolish, to say the least. And Mario Draghi was telling, apparently, Boris that they would be unable to support the position given their massive reliance on Russian hydrocarbons. So everybody, pretty much a lot of countries in Europe were not true partners until much recently when Ukraine started winning and they started seeing that, oh, maybe Ukrainians are tough. Maybe Ukrainians can win this. Maybe we don't have to fold like little, minions to Russia. And they didn't realize in the beginning, in February, that had they all gotten together, had a very strong response against Russia, saying the entire European Union and every country would have voiced that are against Russian aggression. And if you step into Ukraine, we will respond accordingly. Putin would not have had the same reaction of, I'll just go through Ukraine because I can see that the entire European Union is weak. So very interesting that Boris mentioned that, calling out some leaders. And you can see following yesterday's attack of Russia, a lot of Russians are rejoicing. And I just showed a picture on Telegram. This is a pro-Russian channel. And it's a very interesting sample of the Russian attitude. Yes, does it give an overall outlook of the Russian people? No, it does not. But it's a sample. And here you can see that every single text is pretty much indicating how happy they are that Ukraine is without light. This one says that we have electricity and heat. We're from Russia. And then other ones are saying, in Moscow, everything is lit up and we only even have, Christmas trees lit up. Just overall joy at seeing the misery of others that they've caused is absolutely inhumane behavior, in my opinion. And a lot of Russians, especially in urban centers, have that attitude. It's very polarizing because you have really people that are against Putin in Russia, and then you have the ultra, super fascist, chauvinistic people in Russia that have this type of attitude because they were brought up by just terrible parents, by terrible education with a corrupt society. It just brings up the worst of you. Imagine living in a country where thieves, corruption, everything is rampant. You hear about inequalities. You become one. And that's just the product of a terrible, post-Soviet Russia, in my opinion. You can see here that this was a satellite image taken yesterday, and pretty much a whole blackout in the entirety of Ukraine. It wasn't. I can't even see a little brightness somewhere on the map. So sad to see that the Russians still rejoice at all of this. And this was what I was talking about in terms of the mines. The Russians have just thrown it all over the fields, and you can see it's a massive operation. You need to clear each and one of them. It takes a long time, so it's a lot of work to do. But again, who puts mines like that? I don't really understand. Like, this looks like some I don't even know, like a Stonehenge, like assembly of mines. They didn't put anything in the middle, it appears. Perhaps they did, but it makes no sense to me. Yeah. And unfortunately, yesterday as well, the Ukrainian doctors, which are heroes as well, saving people's lives, had to revolve around generators to treat patients for surgeries. You can see, and this is what the Russians are, cheering about, to seeing just the misery and the difficulty that the Ukrainians have to struggle with because of a war that they started. Yeah, it's really something to be seeing, with modern equipment, and they have to work in the dark like this. It's just unacceptable to live under such conditions. And the doctors are doing really in Ukraine doing miracles. It's fantastic that they have the will, and seeing just the moral trauma that these people have as well, the psychological trauma that you get from just operating so many patients with probably massive injuries. We're not talking about removing the appendix here. We're talking about potentially limbs ripped off, and just other atrocities. So a huge thank you to all the doctors and nurses in Ukraine, and the volunteers as well that go to Ukraine to help with the wounded. And last video is from the potato Führer, Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, indicating that, if anybody needs to step down, it's the Ukrainians. It's all up to them, And let's hear it. There are subtitles here. It says, everything is in the hands of the Ukrainian people. Not because I want to blame Zelensky or Ukraine, but I kind of want to. They don't want massive deaths. If they don't want difficult, tough, hard, but they have to restore if they want. They have to stop the war, because then Ukraine will be fully destroyed. And who's destroying it, right? It's so funny. Who's destroying Ukraine? Is it the Ukrainians? It's funny how they're reverting the cards towards Ukraine here. Who's using artillery to destroy Ukraine? Surely it's not the Ukrainian people. It's the Belarusian state allowing the Russians to use their artillery in Belarus and their missiles in Belarus, including in Russia, to destroy Ukraine. So if anybody can stop this war, it's a rhetoric question, but it's only Belarus. Only Belarus and Russia can stop this war if they decide to do that. And that's not going to happen, unfortunately, because you see that these madmen are just passing the ball towards Ukraine, telling them that it's their fault. So you can't negotiate with them, unfortunately. And that's it, guys. So that's all I have to say to you today. Again, a huge thank you for your support. I really appreciate it. Leave me a comment about what you think about what Lukashenko said today. And yeah, thank you. I will see you in the next video. Thank you.